Everyday lives, everyday values. A thoughtful and in-depth look at the issues and interests that are unique to Utah. Special discussions of history and LDS heritage, and an enriching exchange of ideas about local culture. Their Everyday Lives, Everyday Values on KSL News Radio 102.7 FM and 1160 AM.
I so appreciate you joining us this morning here on Everyday Lives, Everyday Values. And when this book from Deseret Book landed on my desk, I thought, boy, we need to talk about this one, Surviving Hitler, the unlikely true story of an SS soldier and a Jewish woman. And I'm delighted to have as a very special guest, Brother Palm, joining us on the program today. And thank you for being our guest here. Welcome.
Thank you for being here.
And perhaps, would you mind pronouncing your first name? I didn't want to risk that. I want to make sure we get it right.
Hakan.
Hakan.
You had it right.
As I mentioned, when I saw this book, I was immediately intrigued. Wow, an SS soldier and a Jewish woman. And you mentioned where the title says an unlikely true story, you'd actually considered putting love story in there.
People were reading it, before it was decided. One editor at the Desert Book, and she said, this must be a fiction.
There is, in the opening pages of the book, President Monson now, Elder Monson, at various times in this story, actually let a rather significant family secret out.
That's right. And my father, he took it in a different way than I did that time. President Monson was there to divide Stockholm's stake. And when the procedure, the formalities were over, he stood in the pulpit up there. I was sitting also on the stage, so I saw my father sitting a few benches down there. And then he stood up and he said, "Brothers and sisters, this has been a real Palm Sunday. Gustav's son-in-law has been called to be the stake president in the new stake. Gustav himself has been called and set apart today to be a temple sealer. And his son Hakan, which is me, has been called to be the first presidency in the second stake here in Stockholm, the Stockholm South stake." And then, from his memory, back in 1984, when I presented them first time, there he stands in the pulpit, and suddenly he said, "Agnes and Gustav, they were preserved by the Lord to come here, and through miracles during wartime they met each other." And then he told everyone of it. And for my father, this was a family secret. My mother, on the other hand, she was a victim, so that story was out,
That's okay.
And my sister sat next to my father, and she saw how the knuckles was whitening on the hands of my father down there. And I was almost, "What are you saying, Elder Monson there?"
Yeah.
And after I went down to my father, and then he said, and he had greater faith in me, he said, "An apostle said this. There's probably meaning with it."
And so few people knew that he had been an SS.
I mean, it was his bishop, and it was in the family, and President Monson.
And now everybody knows.
Everyone. There were 1,600 of them there, And everyone, of course, loves this humble man. He had come into the situation of being a German soldier between hard and rock. He has been serving the Lord since 1953 and built a congregation that was made into a ward and was a temple sealer, So there's been nothing negative that has been said about him. If that had not happened there, this story would not be out now to inspire people.
I just barely got this from our friends at Deseret Book, but I have just been engrossed. I love the format where we learn about Agnes, and then we go a page or two, and then we learn more about Gustav, and then it goes back and forth. But the early memories, I think she was 4 years old. Your mother shares a memory in here of her first remembrance of beauty and the visit to a gypsy camp and recalling being baptized a Catholic and her father giving her instructions. Now, if you are asked, you are a Catholic. Tell us a little bit about your mom.
They were Jewish, They had converted the Catholic in 22 because due to the fact that my grandfather, he believed in Jesus Christ. So they didn't become Catholics to escape Nazis. And she had a great faith in Jesus. She lived very strong her values. And then they were taken, 1944, in June, July, they were taken in the cattle wagons up to Auschwitz. People really didn't know what was happening, but a great anxiety was going on among the 80 people in that cattle wagon. Someone said, "Didn't you hear BBC? They were talking about extermination camps." no, that's just war propaganda from the other side.
Yeah.
And someone else, they were screaming, and some tried to suicide themselves. And then suddenly men started to place their hands on their family members, and due to Jewish tradition gave them the patriarchal blessings. And then my father, who was a Christian, but he was a Jew too, he told my mother, sit up. And he gave her a father's blessing in the Hungarian language, not Hebrew. He was a Christian, not a Jew, but he did it in a Jewish way. And she accepted it. And in that blessing he said, I and your mother will soon die, but we will have no pain, but you will survive due to the fact that you have a pure heart and have honored your mother and father by not escaping alone when you were given that opportunity. You'll survive, and one day you will find the truth. She took this to her heart, and she said it was natural for him to do that as a father. He gave me a blessing. And then they came to Auschwitz, and she found herself standing on the platform where they sorted people, and they were not really, what is going on here, It came in 12,000 people per day that they had to kill, Oh, it's unbelievable.
I'd like you to tell more about this, because I did read this part. Your mother, when everyone was herded into the ghetto, a very kind person, offered to save her.
Yeah.
And she said no, unless my mother and father can
That's
go.
right. And that happened once more. And when she did that, she says, I received an inner peace that was with me during the war. And I have felt the most peaceful time in my life in the concentration camp and things around there.
I cannot even fathom this. I'm looking at the clock, and we are so quickly going to run out of time. Let's get to your dad. There were speeches being made, quite a famous speech that was made, talking about that if the Norwegians, in this case, would rally around the Nazis, that there would be favors, and this would be a good way to go. And your dad ultimately did join a year later, but it wasn't long thereafter he realized that this was not a good thing.
He was offered to become a traffic police, and he went to the police academy. During the time he was there, a course was added by the Germans, how to be a camp guard. And then on the first assignment he got after his education was to go to a newly built camp, Berg, just outside Tönsberg. And they hadn't even had time to build the fences yet, so they were going there guarding as fence, There was common use in there. And they haven't really heard of those things. And what are we to do with them? Yeah, you're to watch them and keep them here because we're sending them to Germany. Then he wanted to resign, but he was denied that. And if you try to escape, we will get you placed in the prison here. A few months later, there was a campaign going on. If you volunteered as a front soldier with Waffen-SS, then he could get away from it. He decided to do that, but then he could at least fight the communists and help the Finns.
Let's take a break at this juncture. When we come back, maybe we could quickly address how your parents survived and how ultimately they met. Surviving Hitler, the title of the book, the unlikely true story of an SS soldier and a Jewish woman, here on Everyday Lives, Everyday Values.
I'm Tom Shane, and growing up in the...
We're back on Everyday Lives, Everyday Values. And boy, when we have a topic like this and a guest like this and a book to talk about like this, I wish we had so much more time. But as we talk with Brother Palm, who is here, Surviving Hitler, the unlikely true story of his parents, an SS soldier and a Jewish woman, in the time we have remaining, how did your folks survive this horrific event?
Yeah, that's the unlikely true story. For instance, when my father came to the front, 140 went out in the company. 3 survived, and 2 of them were staff people. The first day he came there, he was the less valuable man, so he was placed in front of the tanks when they were to go break through. So he was with his M34 machine gun running out there, and then the Russians started to shoot at him and his friends, and then the tanks saw where they were hiding themselves, the Russians, so then they could fire them. So they had fire from front and fire from back. And then he suddenly had a feeling inside himself to take a step to the right. And he did. And then a bullet took some part of the skin on his cheek. But if he hadn't done that, it would go right through his head. Then he had a bullet through his leg. And he continued to run because he had adrenaline in his body,
Sure.
Came up the hill and suddenly he was through and the tanks came after. And things like that happened not once, not twice. He got medals too. And if we go to the part of my mother, Can you imagine coming to the platform in Auschwitz? You don't really know what is happening, but you are seeing that they are sorting you in groups, and you are in a group where here are older people and kids, and in the other group there are healthy women, and they are young and look stronger. It's better to be in that group.
Yeah.
So she was able to sneak into that group, and when she came there, they said, "How did you do that?" The one who did it before, she was shot immediately. And the group that she left in, that was her mother and father. And father, he was the one head taller than the other. So he turned around and shouted just out to his daughter there, "Remember what I said." And then he pointed to heaven. "We'll meet up there," he said. And then they went direct to the procedure of going into the gas chamber. And she escaped there and came into a barrack where there were Hungarians that were picked out to be slave workers. She came to Bremen at the end of the war, when the Americans were coming from one front on the west and the Russians from the other one. The Germans emptied concentration camp, and they got many of them to Bergen-Belsen, built for 7,000. It was housing now at the end of the war 70,000.
Oh.
So it was a terrible place. It was worse than hell to come there. And one day she was so very tired, and she walked there, and she came to a tent, and she felt that the back of the fabrics there, it was a little bit soft, so she lay down there. And in the morning when she woke up, she found that she had been sleeping on corpse. And then she was taken by the Prince Folke Bernhardt in the Red Cross white buses up to Lübeck, and from Lübeck up to Sweden.
How in the world did your folks meet?
They were preserved by the God, if you believe what President Monson said, and I cannot deny that. And the way they met then in Sweden, that's a miracle too.
How did they meet in Sweden?
You know, father, he was taken back to Norway, and from there he was exiled to Sweden due to the fact that his father was a Swede. And my mother, she came, as I told you, by buses up to Göteborg in Sweden. And there she had to recover for a few months. And then she was sent to a place called Långshyttan. And there she got her first job. My father, he was now exiled, and it was in the winter time. And it was minus 10 degrees Celsius. And he just had a used suit. They asked him, "Do you have any relatives in Sweden?" Yes, 11 years ago, a cousin to me visited me in Norway named Helge Palm. Where did he live? Where does he live? He lived at that time in Långshyttan. So they gave him a ticket on the train, one-way ticket to Långshyttan. But what about if he's not there, he was thinking. So he got 5 crowns, less than $1 in his pocket. He invested 40% of his fortune in his telegram.
Yeah.
And he just signed it. Helge Palm, Långshyttan. I will be at the railroad station tomorrow morning, 8:20. Can you come and see me? And in the morning when he came there, who stands there? They recognized each other immediately after 11 years. So due to sort of by chance, Helge was there 14 days between 2 jobs. And in this 14 days, he had taken a job in the steelworks. So he brought my father there, and he could continue with the job. And he went to a restaurant to eat, you know. And there was a brunette standing, giving them food, on the line. And she saw this terrible, pale, sad man coming there, and she gave him food, and after a few days he wasn't there. So she asked his friends, "Where is the man with the sad eyes? He's sick. Where does he live?" 200 yards away. She took a trail, went there, and she saw when she opened the door, he cannot eat this pork. He was vomiting there, green in his face. So she went back and got a new trail with biscuits and tea. And she did that for 2 days just to be nice to him. Can you imagine? She's in a country that cannot, their language doesn't have any friends. Her family's murdered. And she's sitting there outside on a bench. And here comes this sad man who was pale. And he knocked her on the shoulder and said, "I do want you to know that what you did to me, you are the first one in 5 years that have done something nice to me and kind. So would you mind, on my first salary, I have bought 2 cinema tickets. Can you accept to come with me?" "Yes," she said. And they went there. And then mother said, in the darkness there, he touched my hand. And I grabbed it. And I've held it for almost 70 years. Father had to tell her the background, and he watched her reaction be. Then she said with tears in her eyes, I have known it all the time, what you've been doing.
I can see where some at Deseret Book would say this is like fiction.
Yes.
It is so incredibly beautiful. You can hardly believe that this story is real. We, sadly, are out of time. But what a wonderful story to share. And the book is titled Surviving Hitler, The Unlikely True Story of an SS Soldier and a Jewish Woman. And Brother Palm, I can't thank you enough for sharing this book, this story, and your time with us here on Everyday Lives, Everyday Values. And obviously there is so much more. I'm so anxious to complete the book, and I would encourage our listeners right now to do the same. Surviving Hitler. Thank you, and my best to you. And when you see your mother and father, give them a hug for us all.
I will.